I sometimes wonder if my mother ever really saw me. I mean, truly saw me for who I was, not just as Jake's sister or as the responsible one who could take care of herself. Growing up in our household meant understanding very early on that there were two sets of rules, one for me and one for my brother Jake. By the time I was 14, I had already learned that the quickest way to disappoint my mother was to need something. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. I got my first job when I was 15, working weekends at a local cafe. I still remember how my hands smelled like coffee grounds and dish soap for months. My mother didn't drive me to my interview or help me fill out my application. Instead, she said, "Emma's so independent." When her friends asked why a 15-year-old was riding her bike 3 miles to work at 6 a.m. on Saturday mornings. Independence wasn't something I chose. It was something thrust upon me. The same month I started working, my mother spent $500 on a gaming console for Jake because, according to her, boys need an outlet for their energy. Jake was 17 and had never held a job. By senior year of high school, I was working nearly 30 hours a week between the cafe and babysitting. My grades never slipped. They couldn't. College was my ticket out, and I knew no one was going to pay for it but me. Meanwhile, Jake had dropped out of community college after a single semester, claiming it was too stressful and not the right environment for him. "Jake's a creative soul," my mother would say, rubbing his shoulder while he played video games at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. "He just hasn't found his path yet." At 20, Jake still hadn't found his path, but he had found my mother's credit card and a talent for maxing it out. When the bills came, my mother would sigh dramatically at the kitchen table, but never once did she confront him. My father was physically present but emotionally absent in all of this. A quiet man who worked long hours at an insurance company, he'd nod along to whatever my mother decided. When I'd try to talk to him about the disparity in how we were treated, he'd just shake his head and say, "That's just how your mother is, Emma. You know she loves you both." But love looked different depending on which child she was facing. During my sophomore year of college, I was working 3 jobs: waiting tables on weekends, working at the campus bookstore between classes, and doing data entry remotely at night. I lived off campus in a tiny apartment with 3 roommates to save on housing costs. My meals consisted mainly of ramen, canned tuna, and whatever was on clearance at the grocery store that week. When I'd come home for occasional visits, Jake would be lounging on the couch, surrounded by takeout containers that my mother had paid for. He'd recently decided he wanted to be a music producer, so my parents had converted half the garage into a studio for him, complete with expensive equipment they couldn't afford. "You work too hard, Emma," my mother would say, as if my work ethic was some character flaw rather than a necessity. "You should enjoy your youth like Jake does." What she never seemed to understand was that someone in the family had to be responsible, and it clearly wasn't going to be Jake or her. By my senior year of college, I had a plan. I was going to graduate, work for 2 years while living as frugally as possible, and save enough for a down payment on a small condo. Property in our area wasn't cheap, but I had calculated exactly how much I needed. $35,000 would give me a 10% down payment on a modest 1-bedroom, plus some extra for closing costs and emergencies. Every dollar I earned that didn't go toward tuition or basic survival went straight into my savings account. When friends went out for drinks or spring break trips, I stayed behind and picked up extra shifts. While classmates bought new clothes or the latest phones, I wore the same 5 outfits on rotation and kept my cracked iPhone held together with packing tape. It wasn't easy, and there were many nights when I cried from exhaustion or questioned if all this sacrifice was worth it. But then I'd picture my own place, a space that was just mine, where no one could tell me I was working too hard or make me feel guilty for not supporting someone else's dreams. I opened my savings account when I was 16, and because I was a minor, My mother had to be a joint account holder. I remember the day clearly. She had seemed annoyed at having to take time out of her schedule to go to the bank with me. The account was supposed to be transferred solely to my name when I turned 18, but between classes and work, I never found the time to visit the bank and complete the paperwork. It didn't seem important then, a clerical oversight that would later cost me everything. By the time I graduated college, I had somehow managed to save $27,000. It had taken years of sacrifice, of saying no to myself over and over again, of working while sick, of missing out on friendships and experiences. But I was closer to my goal than I had ever imagined possible. I found a job at a marketing firm right after graduation. The pay wasn't exceptional for an entry-level position, but it came with health benefits and, most importantly, stability. I moved to a slightly better apartment, though I still had 2 roommates to keep costs down. Within 8 months, I had added another $8,000 to my savings, bringing my total to $35,000. I started looking at condos online, saving listings, and even scheduling a meeting with a mortgage broker. For the first time in my life, I felt proud of myself. Not because someone else had validated me, but because I had set a seemingly impossible goal and achieved it through pure determination. Meanwhile, Jake had cycled through 3 more career paths: personal trainer, quit after 2 weeks because the hours were too rigid; web designer, abandoned when he realized it required actual coding skills; and craft beer enthusiast, which wasn't a job so much as an excuse to drink expensive beer on my parents' dime. At family dinners, which I now attended only on holidays and special occasions, the conversation always centered around Jake's latest venture or crisis. My mother would fret about his future while simultaneously enabling his present. My father would occasionally glance at me with what might have been pride or pity. I could never quite tell which. When I mentioned my condo search during Thanksgiving dinner, my mother nodded distractedly before turning to Jake and asking if he'd thought more about taking some business classes at the community college. "I'm really proud of you, Em," my father said quietly while helping me clear the dishes. One of the few moments of validation I can remember receiving from either parent. I didn't realize it then, but I was on the precipice of a betrayal so profound it would redefine my understanding of family forever. All those years of working myself to exhaustion, of saving every penny, of believing that independence was my greatest strength. They were about to be tested in ways I never imagined. The worst part was that I never saw it coming. Not really. I knew my mother favored Jake, knew she made excuses for him that she'd never make for me, but I never thought she would actually steal from me. I never thought she would look at everything I had worked for and decide that Jake deserved it more. But that's exactly what she did. And the day I found out changed everything. It was a Sunday morning when everything changed. I had just finished a night shift at my weekend job and was scrolling through condo listings on my phone when Jake called. This was unusual in itself. Jake rarely called anyone, preferring to communicate exclusively through texts filled with emojis and abbreviations. "Em, you need to come to Mom and Dad's for dinner tonight," he said, his voice uncharacteristically excited. "I've got big news." I was exhausted and had planned to sleep most of the day, but something in his tone made me agree. "What's going on, Jake?" "Just be there at 6, he said, then hung up without elaborating. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, I immediately sensed something was different. My mother had put out the good dishes, the ones usually reserved for Thanksgiving and Christmas. There were flowers on the table and a bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket. Jake was sitting on the couch, his arm around a petite blonde woman I'd met only twice before. Her name was Melissa, and from what little I knew, she worked at a boutique downtown and had been dating Jake for about 4 months. "Emma!" my mother exclaimed when I walked in, rushing over to hug me with unusual enthusiasm. "Isn't this exciting?" I looked at Jake questioningly. He grinned and Melissa thrust out her left hand, where a sizable diamond ring caught the light. "We're getting married," she announced. The ring looked expensive, far too expensive for someone who hadn't held a steady job in years. I glanced at my parents, wondering if they had funded this purchase. But before I could say anything, my mother was pulling me into the kitchen. "Isn't it wonderful?" she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. "My boy is finally settling down." "It's unexpected," I managed. "They haven't been together very long." My mother waved away my concern. "When you know, you know. This is exactly what Jake needs: stability, purpose." She was already opening the champagne. "And I'm going to throw them the most beautiful wedding." Over dinner, it became clear that no actual planning had taken place beyond Jake's proposal. There was no date, no venue, no budget. But my mother was already talking about flower arrangements and cake tastings as if the wedding was next week. "We're thinking June," Melissa said, twirling her engagement ring. "A summer wedding would be so romantic." June was just 3 months away. I caught my father's eye across the table, seeing the same concern I felt mirrored in his expression. But he said nothing, just nodded along as my mother enthused about potential venues. "The country club would be perfect," my mother declared. "Remember how beautiful Cousin Sarah's wedding was there?" I remembered. I also remembered that Cousin Sarah's parents had spent close to $50,000 on that wedding, and they were considerably better off financially than my parents. "Mom," I said carefully, "the country club is pretty expensive." "This is Jake's only wedding," my mother replied, as if that settled everything. "We'll make it work." In the weeks that followed, my mother transformed from a middle-aged woman who occasionally complained about the cost of groceries into a wedding planning zealot. She created elaborate Pinterest boards, scheduled appointments with high-end vendors, and spent hours on the phone discussing centerpieces and chair covers. When I stopped by their house 2 weeks after the announcement, I found the dining room table covered with brochures for destination bachelor parties and all-inclusive honeymoon resorts. "Mom," I said, picking up a glossy pamphlet for a week-long stay at a Maldives resort that I knew cost more than my annual rent. "How are you planning to pay for all this?" She avoided my eyes. "We've been saving." This was a lie. My parents lived paycheck to paycheck, and any savings they had managed to accumulate had been repeatedly depleted by Jake's various crises and failed ventures. "Have Jake and Melissa set a budget?" I asked. "Are they contributing anything?" My mother's expression hardened slightly. "They're young, Emma. They're just starting out." She shuffled the brochures together defensively. "Not everyone works 3 jobs and denies themselves every pleasure like you do." The comment stung, but I let it go. This was a familiar dynamic. Any suggestion that Jake should take responsibility for his own life was treated as an attack. As the weeks passed, the wedding plans grew increasingly extravagant. My mother had booked the country club, hired a renowned local chef for the catering, and put deposits on a designer wedding dress for Melissa. Jake and his fiancée floated through it all with casual entitlement, offering opinions on menu choices and flower arrangements, but never once discussing who would pay for any of it. I kept my distance from the planning, focusing instead on my condo search. I had scheduled viewings for 3 promising properties and was working with a mortgage broker to get pre-approved. Everything was finally falling into place. Until the morning I checked my bank account and found it empty. I thought it was a mistake at first, some technical glitch that would be quickly resolved. I called the bank in a panic, only to be told that a withdrawal for the full amount, all $35,000, had been made the previous day. "That's impossible," I said. "I didn't withdraw any money." "The withdrawal was made in person," the customer service representative explained. "By Emma Thompson." My name. I drove to the bank immediately, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The branch manager pulled up the transaction details and then showed me the withdrawal slip. It wasn't my signature on that slip. It was my mother's. I drove to my parents' house in a daze, unable to fully process what was happening. My mother was in the backyard, discussing patio heater rentals with a vendor when I arrived. She smiled when she saw me, but her expression faltered at the look on my face. "Emma, what's wrong?" "You took my money," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage and betrayal coursing through me. "You emptied my entire savings account." The vendor, sensing tension, muttered something about coming back later and quickly left. My mother watched him go before turning back to me, her chin raised defensively. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I just needed to finalize a few things first." "Tell me what?" I demanded. "That you stole $35,000 from me? Money that I worked years to save?" "I didn't steal it," she snapped. "I'm still on that account, Emma. I've always been on that account." "That doesn't make it yours." My voice broke. That was my money. For my condo. For my future. My mother sighed, as if I was being unreasonable. Jake needed it more. This wedding is the most important day of his life. I stared at her, unable to comprehend how she could say those words to me without any hint of remorse or awareness of what she had done. More important than my future? Than everything I've worked for? "You can always save up again," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "You're good at that. But Jake only gets married once." In that moment, looking at my mother's face, not guilty, not apologetic, but almost proud of what she'd done for her son, I realized a fundamental truth that had always been there, just beneath the surface of our family dynamic. I would always come second. My needs, my dreams, my very future would always be sacrificed on the altar of Jake's wants. "Jake deserves a perfect day," my mother added, as if this explained everything. And in her mind, it did. I spent that night in my apartment crying until there were no tears left. I felt hollow, as if something fundamental had been scooped out of me. It wasn't just the money, though losing $35,000 was devastating enough. It was the realization that my own mother could betray me so completely and feel justified in doing so. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years and made an appointment with a lawyer. I needed to know my options. The consultation cost $250. Money I could ill afford now that my savings were gone, but I was desperate. The lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Patel, listened to my story with growing concern. When I finished, she sighed and clasped her hands on her desk. "I'm very sorry about your situation, Emma. Unfortunately, from a legal standpoint, your mother had every right to withdraw that money. As a joint account holder, she had equal ownership of those funds." "But it was my money," I protested. "I earned every cent of it. She never contributed anything." "I understand," Ms. Patel said gently, "but the bank doesn't track whose money is whose within a joint account. Legally, it all belongs equally to both parties." "So there's nothing I can do?" My voice cracked. "You could try to sue your mother for the money, but it would be considered a civil matter, not criminal theft. Given that she was on the account, it would be difficult to prove wrongdoing. And even if you won a judgment..." "She doesn't have the money anymore," I finished. "She's spending it on Jake's wedding." Ms. Patel nodded sympathetically. "Your best recourse might be to speak with your family and try to reach some kind of agreement." I almost laughed at the naivety of that suggestion. The lawyer didn't know my mother or Jake. There would be no agreement. When I left the law office, I had one more card to play. I drove to my parents' house, hoping to find my father alone. For once, luck was on my side. His car was in the driveway, but my mother's wasn't. I found him in the garage, organizing his tools. a weekend ritual he'd maintained for as long as I could remember. "Dad," I said, my voice still raw from crying, "did you know what Mom did?" He didn't look at me right away, his hands continuing to methodically sort screwdrivers by size. "About the money?" "Yes, she told me." "And you're okay with it?" I couldn't keep the disbelief from my voice. He finally turned to face me, his expression pained. "I'm not okay with it, Emma. I told her it was wrong." "But you didn't stop her." By the time she told me, it was already done. He ran a hand over his thinning hair. The deposits were made. Contracts were signed. "So you're just going to let her get away with it? With stealing my future?" My father looked genuinely conflicted, but in his hesitation, I saw the answer I'd always known. He would never stand up to my mother, not even for me. "I'll talk to her about paying you back," he offered weakly. "After the wedding, when things settle down." I left without responding. We both knew it was an empty promise. After the wedding, there would be no money left to return. When I didn't show up for the next wedding planning dinner, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that made no mention of my savings, instead chiding me for being childish about family obligations. That was when I realized there would be no acknowledgement, no apology, no recognition of the magnitude of what had been done to me. In their minds, I was the one being unreasonable, the selfish daughter-sister who wouldn't celebrate Jake's special day. The situation came to a head at my grandmother's birthday dinner. I had only attended because I couldn't bear to disappoint my dad's mother, who had always been kind to me. The entire extended family was present, including several aunts and uncles who immediately cornered me to ask about my problem with Jake's wedding. "Your mother tells us you've been avoiding family gatherings," my Aunt Susan said. "What's going on with you, Emma? This should be a happy time." Before I could respond, my mother appeared at my side, her hand gripping my arm with false affection. "Emma's just been busy with work. You know how she is. Always working." "Actually," I said, pulling away from her grasp, "I've been dealing with the fact that Mom emptied my savings account to pay for Jake's wedding." A sudden silence fell over the group. My mother's smile became brittle. "Emma, this isn't the time or place." "When would be a better time, Mom? When all the money is gone? When the wedding's over and everyone's moved on except me, who lost everything I worked for?" My aunt looked uncomfortable. "Surely it wasn't your entire savings." $35,000, I said clearly. Every cent I had saved for a down payment on my own place. The shock on my relatives' faces was quickly replaced by awkward discomfort. Family drama was to be avoided at all costs in our circle. "Well," my Uncle David said after a pause, "I'm sure your mother will pay you back eventually. In the meantime, family has to come first, right? Jake only gets married once." And there it was. The same reasoning. The same dismissal. I looked around at their faces and saw nothing but the expectation that I would sacrifice, accommodate, forgive. Because that's what I had always done. Jake, who had been listening from nearby, decided to join the conversation. "It's not like you can't save up again," he said with a shrug. "You're good with money. I'm not. That's just how it is." "You're not good with money," I snapped. "You're irresponsible and entitled. There's a difference." "See?" Jake looked around at the family gathering. "This is the attitude I've been dealing with. She's jealous that I'm getting married, and she's not even dating anyone." "I'm not jealous," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm angry that my future was stolen to fund your party." "It's not a party," my mother interjected. "It's a wedding. It's important." "More important than my home? Than my future security?" "You're being selfish, Emma," my Aunt Susan said, shaking her head. Family supports family. I looked at her incredulously. By stealing from each other? It's not stealing, my mother insisted, her voice tight. I'm on that account. I've always been on that account. After everything I've done for you, raising you, supporting you, this is how you repay me? With public accusations? Supporting me? When have you ever supported me? The words burst out before I could stop them. I've been working since I was 15. I put myself through college. I've never asked you for a cent. My mother's face hardened. And I suppose that makes you better than your brother? Some of us need help sometimes, Emma. Not everyone can be perfect like you. The conversation devolved from there. My mother cried. Family members took sides, most with her, a few remaining uncomfortably neutral. No one, not even my father, explicitly took my side. As I drove home that night, I made a decision that had been forming in my mind since the day I discovered the theft. I would cut ties with my family. Not dramatically, not with a grand announcement, but quietly and completely. I would build my life again from scratch, without them. It was clear now that the support I had always craved would never come, and staying connected only meant more pain, more betrayal. The next day, I changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and set up email filters to automatically archive messages from my family members. I asked my supervisor at work to deny that I was there if any of my relatives called. It was like cutting off a gangrenous limb, painful, but necessary for survival. 8 months passed. I moved to Portland, a city 3 hours away from my hometown. Far enough to make casual drop-ins impossible, but close enough that I didn't have to completely start over career-wise. I found a small studio apartment in a slightly run-down building and took a lateral move at a different marketing agency. I started over, completely. I bought secondhand furniture from thrift stores and garage sales. I cooked every meal at home. I took on freelance projects during evenings and weekends. I opened a new savings account at a different bank with only my name on it. The first few months were the hardest. There were nights when I would lie awake, consumed by anger and grief, mentally calculating how long it would take to save $35,000 again. 5 years, maybe 6, assuming nothing went wrong, assuming I continued to live like a college student well into my 30s. Sometimes I'd think about Jake's wedding, which had happened in June as planned. I'd seen photos on my cousin's Instagram before I blocked everyone. The country club decorations, the 5-tier cake, the ice sculpture that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Melissa's designer dress that my savings had purchased. Jake's beaming face, oblivious to the cost others had paid for his perfect day. Gradually, though, the acute pain dulled to a background ache. I made new friends at work. I joined a hiking group that met on weekends. I started therapy, using the employee assistance program that came with my health insurance. I began to rebuild. By the 8th month, I had managed to save nearly $7,000. It wasn't much compared to what I'd lost, but it was a start. I had a plan for the future that didn't include my family. I was healing. Then my phone rang at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer it anyway. Emma? My mother's voice was thick with tears. Emma, please don't hang up. I should have ended the call immediately. Instead, I said nothing, waiting. I know you're there, she continued. Please, we need your help. We're in trouble. We? I finally spoke, my voice flat. Your father and I, and Jake. She paused. Melissa left him. I wasn't surprised. I'd never thought their relationship would last. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, not feeling sorry at all. But I don't see how this involves me. We're losing the house, Emma. Her voice cracked. The bank. They're foreclosing. We've got 30 days to come up with the money or find somewhere else to live. I closed my eyes, forcing down the automatic guilt response that my mother had spent decades cultivating in me. That's terrible, Mom. But again, I don't see how this is my problem. You're our daughter. The familiar note of accusation crept into her voice. Family helps family. You have a good job, a new life. We have nowhere else to turn. Family helps family, I repeated, the irony almost choking me. Like when you helped yourself to my life savings? Is that what this is about? You're still holding a grudge about that money? After all this time? 8 months. She was acting like it had been years, decades, as if time alone should have erased what she'd done. What happened? I asked, ignoring her question. How did you end up in foreclosure? There was a pause, and I could almost see her weighing how much to tell me, how to frame it to elicit maximum sympathy. The wedding was more expensive than we anticipated, she began. We had to use our home equity line of credit for some of it. And then Jake moved back in after Melissa left, and he's been having a hard time finding work. So you've been supporting him. Again. He's going through a divorce, Emma. He's devastated. They were married for what? 4 months? That's not a divorce. That's a course correction. My mother made a sound of disapproval. You've gotten so hard, Emma. So cold. I've gotten realistic, I corrected her, and I'm still waiting to hear how you ended up in foreclosure. She sighed. We fell behind on the mortgage, with Jake's wedding, and then helping him after Melissa left, we maxed out all the credit cards. Your father's hours got cut at work. It just all happened at once. I knew there was more to it than she was saying. There always was with my mother, selective editing to paint herself in the best possible light. How much do you need? I asked, immediately regretting the question. I wasn't going to help them. I couldn't. Not after everything. 15,000 would stop the foreclosure, she said quickly, hope evident in her voice. We could pay you back over time, of course. Just like she was going to pay back my $35,000? I almost laughed. I don't have $15,000, Mom. I had to start over from zero, remember? But you have some savings, right? And good credit? You could take out a loan. The audacity was breathtaking. She wanted me to go into debt to save them from the consequences of their own choices. Choices that had included stealing from me. No, I said simply. Emma, please. We'll lose everything. Where will we go? I don't know. Where was I supposed to go when you took everything I had? That was different. That was for Jake's wedding. A once-in-a-lifetime event. Apparently not, since he's already headed for divorce. The silence on the other end was charged with hurt and anger. Good. Let her feel a fraction of what I had felt. Your father wants to talk to you, she said finally, and before I could object, there was shuffling, and my dad's tired voice came on the line. Emma? It's Dad. Despite everything, my heart constricted at the sound of his voice. He had failed me when I needed him most, but he was still my father. Hi, Dad. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. What your mother did, it was wrong. I should have stopped her. I should have protected you. His acknowledgement, the first real one I'd received from either of them, loosened something in my chest. Yes, you should have. He sighed heavily. I've spent most of my life taking the path of least resistance, Emma. It was easier to give in to your mother than to fight her. Easier to pretend that her favoritism was just different parenting styles. Easier to look the other way when she enabled Jake's worst tendencies. And now you're paying for it, I said, not unkindly. We all are, he agreed. I don't expect you to bail us out. That's not why I wanted to talk to you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I failed you as a father." Tears stung my eyes. "Thank you for saying that." There was another shuffle, and my mother's voice returned, higher and more desperate. "What did he tell you? Did he convince you to help us?" "He apologized, Mom. That's all." "Apologies don't pay the mortgage, Emma." She was shouting now. "We need real help. We're going to be homeless." "No, you're not," I said calmly. "You'll have to downsize. Maybe rent for a while. You'll have to tell Jake to get a job and support himself. You'll have to live within your means for once. But you won't be homeless unless you choose to be." "How dare you lecture me about—" "Goodbye, Mom," I interrupted. "Don't call this number again." I hung up and blocked the number, then sat in the dark of my small apartment, shaking. I had done it. I had stood my ground. I hadn't let guilt or manipulation sway me. The next day, my work phone rang. It was my mother, asking for me by name. I told the receptionist to say I wasn't available. She showed up at my office the following afternoon. I was in a meeting when the receptionist messaged me, "There's an older woman in the lobby insisting she's your mother. Security is asking if you want to see her." I felt a flash of panic, then anger. This was my workplace, my new life. How dare she bring her drama here? "Please tell security I don't want to see her and she's not welcome," I typed back. "If she refuses to leave, they should call the police." It didn't come to that. Apparently, my mother left when security approached her, but not before making a scene that had my coworkers buzzing with curiosity for days. Then the emails started, first from my mother, then from Jake, then from various relatives. I filtered them to a folder I never opened. They found my social media accounts and sent messages there too. I blocked each one systematically. They were desperate, and desperate people can be dangerously persistent. But I was determined. A week after my mother showed up at my workplace, I received a formal letter from my dad. Not an email, not a text. An actual envelope with a stamp and my father's careful handwriting on the front. Inside was a handwritten note asking if I would meet him alone at a coffee shop halfway between Portland and my hometown. I stared at the letter for a long time. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to maintain the clean break I'd made. But another part, the part that remembered my father teaching me to ride a bike, helping with my science projects, quietly slipping me gas money in college, couldn't dismiss him so easily. After 3 days of deliberation, I texted the number he'd included in the letter. "Saturday, 10 a.m. Just you." He responded immediately, "I'll be there. Thank you, Emma." That Saturday morning, I drove the 90 minutes to the small town we'd agreed on, my stomach in knots. I arrived early and chose a table with a clear view of the door, ordering a black coffee I was too nervous to drink. When my father walked in, I barely recognized him. He had aged years in the 8 months since I'd seen him. His hair was completely gray now, his shoulders stooped, his face lined with exhaustion. He spotted me and hesitated before approaching, as if unsure of his welcome. "Emma," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He sat down across from me, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. "Your mother doesn't know I'm here." "Good." "She wanted to come, but I thought you might be more willing to talk if it was just me." "You thought right." I took a breath. "Dad, I'm not giving you money. If that's why you wanted to meet—" "It's not," he interrupted. "Well, not entirely. I wanted to see you, to make sure you're okay." The simple concern in his voice almost undid me. "I'm fine. I'm rebuilding. It's hard, but I'm doing it." He nodded, his eyes sad. "I'm proud of you, Emma. I always have been. You're so strong, so capable. I think that's part of why. He trailed off. Part of why Mom and Jake feel entitled to take advantage of me. He winced but didn't deny it. Your mother has a blind spot when it comes to Jake. Always has. She sees his needs, his wants, as more urgent than anyone else's. And you've enabled her? Yes. He looked down at his hands. It was easier than fighting. Your mother is... When she wants something, she's like a force of nature. And I'm not a confrontational person. Never have been. So you let her steal from me? He flinched at the word steal, but nodded. I didn't know until after it was done. But yes, I should have done something. Should have insisted she return the money. But you didn't. I kept my voice level, determined not to cry. And now we're losing everything. And it feels like karma. He gave a bitter laugh. The ironic thing is, Jake doesn't even care. When we told him we were losing the house, he just asked if he could store his gaming systems at his friend's place. Despite myself, I felt a pang of sympathy for my father. He was as much a victim of my mother's favoritism as I was, in his own way. What will you do? I asked. We found a small apartment we can afford. Your mother's looking for work for the first time in 30 years. He rubbed his face. It's a wake-up call, Emma. One that's long overdue. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of family dysfunction hanging between us. I've sold my car, he said finally, and my tools, and your mother's jewelry. We've raised about half of what we need to stop the foreclosure. Dad, I'm not asking you for money, he insisted. I just wanted you to know that we're trying, that we're not just expecting a bailout. I studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation, but saw only genuine regret and exhaustion. What about Jake? I asked. Is he contributing anything? My father's expression hardened slightly. He says he can't, that he's going through too much right now to work. Your mother still believes him, but I don't anymore. I've told him he needs to find a job within 30 days or find somewhere else to live. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. You stood up to both of them? He nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. It's amazing what the threat of homelessness will do for your backbone. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. Good for you, Dad. Too little, too late, I'm afraid. We talked for another hour. Really talked, in a way we never had when I was growing up. He told me about his regrets, about watching my mother's favoritism destroy our family, about his own fears for Jake's future. I told him about my new job, my apartment, the friends I was making in Portland. As we were preparing to leave, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. Your mother doesn't know about this either. I've been putting aside a little money each month for years. It's not much, just $3,000. But I want you to have it. I stared at the envelope, emotion closing my throat. Dad, you need that money more than I do right now. No. He pushed it across the table. This was always meant for you. I started it when you got your first job at 15. I was so proud of you, working so hard. I thought maybe someday it could help with college or a car. Why didn't you give it to me before? His face clouded with shame. Your mother found it once. She wanted to use it for Jake's community college tuition. We had a huge fight about it, one of the few times I really stood my ground with her. After that, I kept it in a safety deposit box she doesn't know about. I swallowed hard, looking at the envelope. It wasn't about the money itself, though $3,000 would certainly help. It was what it represented. My father's quiet, imperfect love, expressed in the only way he knew how. Thank you, I said, taking the envelope. Not just for this, for meeting me, for telling the truth. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I love you, Emma. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger for you. We parted with an awkward hug, both of us unsure where we stood now, what kind of relationship we might rebuild from the ashes of the old one. 2 weeks later, I made a decision. I wouldn't give my parents money directly. That door was closed. But I found the name of their mortgage company through my father and made a one-time payment of $5,000 toward their loan. Not enough to save the house, but enough to give them a bit more time, to show that I'd heard my father's apology. I also set some conditions, which I outlined in an email to both my parents. Jake had to move out and support himself. They had to attend financial counseling. My mother had to acknowledge, in writing, what she had done and apologize without qualifications or excuses. We would maintain limited contact, monthly phone calls with my father only, at first. Any violation of these boundaries would result in immediate and permanent no contact. My father responded with gratitude and acceptance. My mother's reply was predictably defensive and manipulative, but eventually, seeing no other option, she agreed as well. It took another 6 months before she finally sent me a genuine apology, one that didn't include phrases like, "but you have to understand," or, "I was only trying to help Jake." By then, they had downsized to the apartment my father had mentioned, Jake had reluctantly taken a job at a warehouse, and my parents were slowly digging themselves out of debt. As for me, I continued rebuilding. The $3,000 from my father and the knowledge that I'd helped my parents without compromising my boundaries gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected to find. I won't pretend this story has a perfect ending. My relationship with my mother will never be what it once was, or perhaps what I always wished it could be. My brother and I remain estranged. Some wounds run too deep for complete healing. But a year after that coffee shop meeting with my father, I put a deposit down on a small condo in Portland. It wasn't the home I had originally planned to buy with my stolen savings, but it was mine. Paid for with money I had earned, protected in an account only I could access. The day I moved in, I received a text from my father. "So proud of you, Emma. You did it on your own terms." And I had. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, the theft, the years of being second best, I had rebuilt my life. Not because of my family, but in spite of them. Some relationships can be rebuilt, but never the same way twice. My mother and I speak now, cautiously, with firm boundaries in place. My father and I talk regularly, our bond stronger in some ways for having been broken and deliberately mended. As for Jake, I heard he finally moved out of my parents' apartment and got his own place. He's still the golden child in my mother's eyes, still struggles with responsibility and entitlement. But his problems are no longer mine to solve. His crises no longer mine to finance. I keep a photo on my refrigerator, not of my family as it was, but of my new condo, keys in my hand, standing on my own front step. It reminds me every day of what I've accomplished, of the power of boundaries, and of the simple truth I learned through all of this. Some people will never change. The real question is, when will you stop waiting for them to?